It's a bright and sunny Saturday afternoon on June 20th, 2020, as I walk about the old rail yards of Chama, New Mexico. In this video, we're going to pay a visit to one of America's truly historic railroad operations, the Cumbres Toltec Scenic Railroad. One of the unique things about this railroad is that visitors have the opportunity to walk around and see the many structures in the yard up close, like the unique 50,000-gallon double-spouted water tank, which is capable of servicing 2 steam locomotives at the same time, or the original Denver and Rio Grande Western wooden coaling tower built in 1924. While it is intact, the tower is not used as part of the railroad's regular operations. Just across the tracks from my camera is the old crew bunkhouse, which was used by railroad train crews when they had to stay in Chama overnight. The spur that has a speeder parked on it is the coal loading track where locomotives are brought every morning to receive a fresh new load of coal, which is loaded into the tender by a front-end loader. Over on the left, right beside the coaling tower, is the original sand house. This is where natural unprocessed sand is brought to be prepared to be used as locomotive sand. A short distance away is the remains of the old brick roundhouse built by the Rio Grande to replace the original wooden roundhouse from 1881 that had burned down in 1899. Sitting in front of the roundhouse remains is General Electric 44-ton center cab diesel number 15, which the railroad acquired in 2013. And sitting over in front of the new engine house by itself is K37 class number 492, and on the left is the railroad's famous rotary OY, built in 1923. Just on the right, next to what's left of the roundhouse, is the tender from Rio Grande number 315, which is filling out a long-term residency here on the Cumbres Toltec. At the south end of the yard is a massive collection of vintage freight equipment. This entire fleet of freight cars was left behind when the Rio Grande pulled out of here after running their final revenue freight train in August of 1968. As a result, the entire collection is now under the ownership of the CNTS. Sitting farther down is one of the old boxcars that was converted to a passenger car in the 1970s because the railroad had no available passenger equipment for its own use after most of the coaches ended up going to the Silverton branch. As a result, many of the passenger cars that the railroad now uses are newer coaches built on old patterns. The next morning, I'm in Antonito, Colorado to board the passenger train to Osier, which today will be powered by K36 Class 282 Mikado number 487. Over on the right, just behind the depot, is the Antonito Locomotive Shop complex, and parked right outside is sister locomotive number 488. Over on the right, next to the entrance road, is more freight equipment. Parked inside the Antonito shop is K36 number 489, which has been disassembled as it is undergoing its FRA-mandated 15-year inspection. Now it's time to climb on board the train for the trip to Osier.
Stop, 2 is forward, 3 is left. Back up. Now there are some other train whistles. It's available in section. Fabulous book. Those are some other whistles, meaning I'm going to cross a road. Otherwise, those are grade crossing. And we are over, start here. This is up. And we're going to go to Osier. And turn right to that.
Doesn't look like
few miles outside of Antonito, the locomotive is working hard as the train begins the climb uphill. As we continue to move farther and farther west, our trip will take us deeper and higher into the San Juan Mountains. As mentioned earlier, number 487 is a K36 Class 282 Mikado locomotive. It is one of 10 such locomotives that were built in 1925 by the Baldwin Locomotive Works in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Except for one, number 485, which was scrapped in 1955 after falling into the turntable pit in Salina, Colorado, the entire K36 class is still preserved and running today, all except for number 483, which is on display at the Cumbres Toltec yard in Chama. The K in the class designation stands for Mikado, which is the name given to the wheel configuration. The 36 equals the locomotive's tractive effort rating, which is 36,000 pounds. This same style and classification was used on all the narrow gauge locomotives the Rio Grande ever owned. Continuing farther west towards Osier, the train approaches Whiplash Curve, one of several landmark locations along the 64 miles of railroad between Antonito and Chama. The name Whiplash Curve comes from the tracks negotiating two back-to-back horseshoe curves, all the while gaining elevation as the railroad climbs higher into the mountains. If you look closely off to the left through the trees, you can see the bottom two layers of Whiplash Curve where the tracks make their way along the hillside below the train. We are now high and deep in the San Juan Mountains as the train continues west towards Osier, which is our lunch stop and the halfway point on the 64 miles of railroad between Chama and Antonito. The rolling foothills and sagebrush of the Caneos Valley have now given way to high mountain passes filled with ponderosa pine and aspen trees. Just up ahead by the locomotive is the first of two tunnels on the railroad. This tunnel is known as Mud Tunnel because of the soft volcanic ash and mud-like substance on the ground at this location. Because of the mud-like substance in this area, the entire inside of the tunnel is lined with wooden supports for its entire length. Several miles farther west, the train emerges from the second of the two tunnels along the line, known as Rock Tunnel. As the train comes out of the tunnel, you can look across and down into the 600-foot depth of Toltec Gorge, 600 feet to the bottom and more than 800 feet across from rim to rim. Just up ahead is a memorial to President James Garfield. A special memorial service was held here in 1881 after receiving the news of the president's assassination. After coming out of Toltec Gorge, the line slowly begins to descend into the Los Pinos River Valley. However, on this trip we will not be making the entire descent into the Los Pinos Valley, as we are coming up on our lunch stop of Osier. Just up ahead, center screen, is the new dining hall that was built by the railroad in the 1980s to provide a place for the passengers to be able to have lunch. In the foreground, wrapping its way around the hill next to the main line, is a loop track that was built by the railroad in the early 1970s to provide a place for trains to turn around. This is where our train will be turned around for the return trip to Antonito at the end of our lunch break. After the lunch break, all the passengers are back on board as number 487 backs the train through the loop track at Osier before beginning the return trip to Antonito. Having completed the turning procedure at Osier, we are now on the move headed back to Antonito. We have also made our second passage through Rock Tunnel and are now exiting back out the east end of Toltec Gorge. Coming up just ahead is another famous location known as Phantom Curve. The location was given the name Phantom Curve for the ghostly shapes and shadows that would be seen in the locomotive headlight whenever a train would pass through here at night. The shadows were formed by the light reflecting on the solid rock formations next to the tracks at this curve. As we head back down the mountain towards Antonito, the train rolls past the old siding at Bighorn, New Mexico. Just on the opposite side of the main line is an old Y that was built in the late 1800s, which is currently being occupied by 2 gondola cars that were brought up from Antonito. This location is also known as Rattlesnake Point because during the summer months, this is a popular location for the aforementioned reptile. In just a few seconds, we will be crossing over the state line back into Colorado. Continuing east, we pass the upper end of the connecting track at Lava, New Mexico. During the winter months, it was often necessary to run the rotary snowplow up the mountain from Chama to keep the line open to allow the 24 hours a day, 7 days a week operation. The connecting track here at Lava made it possible for the rotary train to turn around and head back to Chama without having to head all the way into Antonito just to be turned on the Y. Coming up ahead on the right-hand side of the train is the lava water tank. Although there has always been a water tank at this location since the railroad was built, this is not the tank that was originally built at this location. This was the water tank originally located in Antonito at the north end of the Y, just above the original Antonito depot. It was relocated here in the late 60s to replace the original lava tank, which was in very bad shape. Although the tank is still 100% intact, it has not been in use since 1972 due to a problem with the pumping mechanism that was required to fill the tank with water from the nearby Los Pinos River. Rolling back into Antonito, the train passes a siding occupied by more of the old freight equipment that was left behind when the Rio Grande pulled out of here in 1968. The tank car that we have just passed is sometimes used by the railroad for fire mitigation, as well as overgrowth control to keep overgrowth from encroaching on the right-of-way. In just a moment, we will pass through the last two remaining road crossings before arriving back at the Antonito station. Before we arrive back at the station, the train will make its way through the loop track at Antonito that encircles the parking lot and the locomotive shop, as well as the new depot that was built for the Cumbres Toltec in the 1970s. Sitting next to the entrance road to the depot parking lot is K37 class number 495, along with a string of more freight cars, and the steel frames for two of the railroad's newer coaches that are currently under construction. The train passes the water tank and enters into the loop track as it prepares to run around the shop building before arriving back at the depot. Sitting next to one of the under construction coaches is 489's tender, along with General Electric 44-ton center cab diesel number 19. This is a sister to the number 15 in Chama. Both of these locomotives came from the Oahu Railway in Hawaii and were built in 1943. Number 19 has spent virtually its entire life in preservation on the Cumbres Toltec, beginning in 1972, while number 15 originally spent many years on the Georgetown Loop Railroad in northern Colorado, just outside of Denver. Pulling back into the Antonito station, we pass by yet another static display K-37, number 494. The K-37 class locomotives were originally built as the standard gauge Class 190-280 consolidations in 1902 by the Baldwin Locomotive Works. This will conclude our coverage of the Cumbres Toltec Scenic Railroad. The next morning I would be off for the drive to Albuquerque to catch Amtrak train number 3 for the overnight journey back to Los Angeles. Until next time, thanks for watching.